Welcome to TOCHI Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The sun had barely risen, but Richard was already awake, ironing the clothes Linda would wear to a job interview she barely remembered scheduling. Their one-bedroom apartment was suffocating in heat, the standing fan clicking from exhaustion. But Richard didn't mind. For the past 6 years, he had juggled teaching and part-time tutoring just to keep their lives from falling apart. Linda had once been grateful, once smiled when he brought her suya after payday, once kissed his forehead and called him her hero. But now, she barely looked him in the eye. He had no car, no house, no flashy clothes. Just lesson notes, lesson plans, and love. Deep, patient love. He didn't mind skipping his own lunch so she could eat. He didn't mind patching his old shoes with glue if it meant she had something better on her feet. He had become a silent soldier in their marriage, bleeding in places she never bothered to look. Her younger sister, Pamela, wasn't helping. Richard had paid her WAC fees, bought her school shoes, and even let her sleep on the bed while he took the mat, just so she could stay focused in school. But now, with barely a diploma and a few Instagram followers, Pamela had begun to bite the very hand that fed her. "You're too fine for this man, Linda," she'd say, watching him wash clothes outside like a houseboy. "You deserve a man that fits your shine. What's the point of beauty if you're suffering?" Linda would pretend to ignore her, but deep inside, Richard could feel her slowly absorbing those words. He caught her staring too long at flashy men who drove past. Her tone toward him became curt, her touch less affectionate. But Richard didn't argue. He believed that love, the kind they once shared, could survive the storms of change, if only he held on. Every weekend, Richard found ways to surprise her, cooking her favorite jollof, leaving little notes in her purse, texting her Bible verses in the afternoon. But Linda's reactions grew colder by the day. "Why don't you just bring me money instead of poems?" she said one evening, tossing aside a handwritten letter he had carefully folded and sealed. He swallowed the pain and smiled. "Things will get better, I promise." He didn't see himself as poor, just as someone who hadn't peaked yet. "Let's hold hands and climb together," he once said. Linda didn't reply. Her silence had become louder than any insult. Richard still pressed her clothes, packed her lunch, smiled as she left, even though her goodbyes had turned into grunts. He never stopped loving her. He didn't know that she had already stopped loving him. The day Linda's mother collapsed from her chronic illness, it was Richard who carried her to the hospital, paid the emergency deposit, and even slept on a plastic chair beside her bed for 3 nights straight. Linda wept when she saw him praying over her mother's frail body, but not from love, from guilt. Yet even guilt could not overpower pride. Richard borrowed money to cover her medications, secretly took a high-interest loan, and delayed paying his own school's union dues. His colleagues teased him, "Are you a husband or a houseboy?" But Richard smiled through the mockery. He believed marriage meant carrying each other's burdens. To him, Linda's problems were his to solve. His loyalty wasn't performance, it was his very nature. But with every act of kindness, Linda drifted further. To her, his sacrifices became invisible, expected, even annoying. She began calling him too nice, as if decency had become a flaw. When Richard received a call that his father's farmland had been sold off by a cousin, he wept. That land was all he had left from his late parents. It was his backup plan, his dream project. But he had sold it voluntarily, to pay for Pamela's hostel fees and Linda's short tailoring course when she wanted to start a business. The tailoring dream died after 2 months, but the land was gone forever. And still, Richard did not complain. When they had no food, he cooked rice with dry pepper and oil, and when they had little, he split it without a word. Pamela, now growing bolder, mocked him openly. "Can't you hustle like real men? Teachers are the reason Nigeria is backward." Linda giggled instead of defending him. It stung more than a slap. Even when Richard came home with gifts, they were received like crumbs, not kindness. He began to feel like a ghost in his own home. But Anita saw him. She was Linda's best friend and the only person who still treated Richard with dignity. One evening, as he returned from work with a bloodshot eye after a motorbike fall, Anita had been the one who rushed to clean his wound. "You're too good to be treated like this," she whispered. But Richard just smiled. "I married her. I'll love her for life." Anita nodded, but her heart broke silently. She knew her friend. Linda was drifting into the world of envy, the kind that wanted a man with flash, not depth. Richard didn't realize it then, but Linda's heart was no longer rooted in their history. It was floating, waiting to be snatched by the next man with shiny things. All he had were promises, quiet loyalty, and a bleeding heart. In a world obsessed with appearance, that was no longer enough. The month Pamela was set to write her final exams, there was a rent deadline looming. Richard had just received his annual bonus, a small sum, but it meant he could either clear 2 months' rent or pay for Pamela's exam fees. Without hesitation, he chose Pamela. He told the landlord they'd pay half now and the rest later. "I don't want her to feel like I failed her," he said. Linda watched quietly as he handed Pamela the envelope. "Thank you," Pamela muttered, barely hiding her irritation that it wasn't more. Richard didn't mind. He had come to accept that gratitude wasn't always loud. What mattered was that they were still one family. But Linda rolled her eyes when he left the room. "He thinks he's a hero," she whispered to Pamela. "He's just doing what any man should." The words hit like daggers behind his back, and still he smiled. When Linda's father died suddenly, it was Richard who handled every aspect of the burial. He borrowed, begged, and even pawned his late mother's gold earrings to give the man a proper resting. Through tears, he stood beside Linda during the ceremony, holding her hand. But at the reception, he overheard her tell a guest, "If only I had married better, this whole event would have looked like a senator's." That night, he cried quietly in the bathroom. Anita came by the next day to drop off food. She saw the swollen eyes but said nothing. "Thank you for standing by her," she said instead. Richard only nodded. He had grown used to hurting in silence. The more he gave, the more invisible he became. What no one saw was that he wasn't just feeding a family, he was feeding their dreams, their egos, their pride, at the expense of his own soul. Things grew worse when Linda began going out without telling him. Pamela took charge of the house, now ordering Richard around like a tenant. "Clean the sitting room," she once barked. "Linda likes things tidy." He complied without protest. His love had turned him into a doormat, and he didn't know how to stop. At church, people began to whisper. Some called him weak. Others called him a fool. Only Anita remained a quiet voice of reason. "One day she'll regret this," she told him. But Richard, still clutching the dream of a better tomorrow, replied softly, "As long as she's happy, I'm okay." He didn't know that Linda's idea of happiness was already being redefined, and that his part in her story was about to be erased. Pamela was relentless. Every day felt like an audition for Linda's self-destruction. "You're too fine for this life," she'd say, sitting cross-legged on the couch, scrolling through her phone. "Look at your mates on Instagram. Getting flown to Dubai, marrying rich. You're here folding clothes for a teacher." Her voice was like a dripping tap, steady and corrosive. Linda began listening more than she used to. She started comparing. Richard, despite his loyalty, began to look smaller in her eyes, not because he shrunk, but because she stopped seeing him as the man who held her hand through storms. Instead, she saw only the dust on his shoes, the holes in his belt, the cracked phone screen. The man who once made her proud now reminded her of all the things she wanted to escape. Pamela's words didn't fall on deaf ears. They planted seeds, and pride watered them. Church didn't help either. At the women's group, whispers followed Linda everywhere. "She's pretty, but she married down," someone said during fellowship. Imagine if she had gone for that banker who used to toast her. Linda smiled politely, but inside she simmered. Her beauty had become a curse, a mirror that reflected her regrets. She started dressing more extravagantly, using money Richard didn't have. Makeup kits replaced textbooks on their shared shelf. She stayed out late, claiming networking events and seminars. But everyone knew she was chasing something, validation, perhaps, or escape. When Richard asked gently, "Are we okay?" she nodded with a practiced smile. "We're fine." But in her mind, she was already gone. What kept her physically there wasn't love, It was convenience, and even that was growing old. Anita saw the change too. She tried warning Linda one day after a Sunday service. Don't let the world confuse you. You have a man others are praying for. But Linda scoffed. Anita, I know you mean well, but you wouldn't understand. You're not married. Anita blinked but said nothing. She didn't need to remind Linda that love wasn't about labels, that single women could still recognize when someone was being mistreated. Richard overheard the conversation from the hallway. He didn't interrupt. He just walked back inside and quietly folded the laundry Linda had left on the floor. Each shirt he folded felt like a prayer. Each sock he paired felt like a plea. But prayers without respect were like whispers in a storm. They got drowned out. And Richard's voice, once strong in Linda's life, was now barely a murmur. It was a hot Saturday morning when Richard, on his way home from tutoring a student, saw a crowd cheering outside a local convenience store. A man had just won a small prize from a lottery scratch ticket. Smiling at the joy in the air, Richard bought 2 tickets for fun, thinking it might cheer Linda up. He used his last N500, the same money meant for Beans and Gary, and tucked the ticket into a small envelope. When he gave it to her, she barely looked up. What's this? She asked. A surprise, he said, grinning. Linda rolled her eyes, but scratched it anyway. At first, she was quiet. Then she screamed, Jesus! Oh my God! Her hands shook. Richard leaned forward. What is it? Her voice cracked. I think I just won for £1,000,000. The room spun with disbelief. For the first time in months, they hugged. But even that joy felt short-lived. By Monday, Linda had opened a new bank account without telling Richard. She contacted the lottery office herself, dressed in her best wig and makeup, and posed for pictures holding the oversized check. Richard wasn't even in the photo. When he asked if he could accompany her to finalize the paperwork, she said flatly, It's my name on the ticket, not yours. That night, she ordered peppered snails and grilled turkey from a food delivery service, something they never used before. Richard smiled nervously. We should be careful how we spend. Let's make this work for us long term. Linda barely looked at him. I didn't ask for a lecture. I've been poor all my life. Let me breathe. Pamela, who had come to stay the night, clinked her glass of wine and laughed. To breathing without broke boys. Richard forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. The money didn't change Linda. It revealed her. Within a week, she had changed her wardrobe, her friends, her speech, and even her ringtone. She now referred to Richard as my past, even while he cooked her meals and ironed her new designer clothes. Pamela became her shadow, helping her select wigs and push her into higher social circles. The house changed too. Linda bought new curtains, new bed sheets, and a smart TV, but Richard still slept on the same mat when guests came around. He felt like a tenant in his own marriage. The woman he once fasted for now looked at him like a burden. And through it all, Richard still kissed her goodnight, still prayed for her while she slept, still believed this was a phase. But the truth was simpler. Linda had begun to see herself as someone too big for him, and money had only sharpened that illusion. 2 weeks after her win, Linda packed a few designer bags and told Richard she was needing space. She moved into a service short-let apartment with a pool and rooftop lounge. She left no explanation, no plan, just a half-written note that read, Don't take it personal. Richard stood in the doorway for hours after she left, holding the note in one hand and the curtain she picked in the other. He didn't know what hurt more, her absence or the cold ease with which she executed it. When he called, she didn't pick. When he texted, she replied late. Pamela told everyone they're on a break, but it was clear. Linda had left him emotionally long before she left physically. Richard cleaned the empty house and whispered, She'll come back. But the silence screamed louder than hope. Linda began attending brunches hosted by influencers. She posted photos with captions like, From trenches to treasure. And God did it. But she never mentioned Richard. Not once. Toby came into her life like a whirlwind, a tall, muscular, smooth-talking businessman who claimed to run 3 companies and had connections in politics. Linda fell fast. He took her out in flashy cars, bought her a diamond-studded wristwatch on credit, and told her she was a queen who had just been trapped in the wrong castle. She believed every word. When he suggested they do a co-branded wedding to go viral, she jumped at the idea. "This will shut up all the people who mocked me," she said. "Especially that poor ex of mine." Meanwhile, Richard, still loyal, still confused, kept texting, "Are you okay?" The message was never read. Anita grew concerned. She visited Richard's apartment one afternoon and found him surrounded by unopened food packs, all bought out of habit for someone who no longer lived there. "You need to stop waiting," she told him gently. Richard's eyes welled up. "She's my wife. I just want her to be safe." Anita shook her head. "She's not lost. She left. And you're breaking in her silence." But Richard wasn't angry. He still remembered the Linda who once brought him hot tea during exam week, who once slept on the floor with him during their first month of marriage. "Maybe that Linda is still in there somewhere," he whispered. Anita sat beside him and said nothing, because deep down she knew the woman he loved had been replaced by someone fame couldn't satisfy, and pride would soon destroy. It happened on a rainy Thursday, the kind of day Richard would normally use to reflect, teach his students, or run errands for Linda. But instead, he found himself standing in his own compound, soaked, staring down the barrel of his reality. Two private security men in black suits were at the gate with an eviction letter, not from a landlord, but from Linda. She had sent them along with Pamela, who arrived smirking in high heels and a designer bag Richard had never seen before. "You don't live here anymore," Pamela announced, tossing his clothes into a cheap nylon bag. "Your tenancy expired the moment your account balance couldn't match your mouth." Richard looked stunned, confused. "This is my home," he said softly. "I paid the rent. I painted the walls with my hands." But the men were unmoved. Linda wasn't there. She was at a photo shoot in Lekki, showing off a champagne glass on Instagram while her husband was being kicked out. The neighbors gathered in silence. Some watched with pity, others with mockery. "Nah, that teacher be this," someone whispered. "I heard she won millions. Nah, she day dump em." The shame wrapped itself around Richard like a second skin. Still, he didn't shout. He didn't fight. He simply bent down and picked up his books from the puddle, shaking water from his spines. Pamela laughed. "You still read these useless books? You better learn how to toast rich women or start selling recharge cards. Because loyalty can't pay rent." She strutted away, heels splashing through the mud. Richard stood there for a while after the car left. He had no umbrella, no plan, and nowhere to go. The same house he once built with dreams and promises now stood behind him like a tomb. The betrayal didn't come from a stranger. It came from a woman whose ring he still wore. That night, he slept inside his old Corolla, parked beside a mechanic shop. He used his shirt as a pillow and clutched a framed photo of him and Linda from their early marriage. She had her arms wrapped around him in the picture, beaming with the innocence of a woman who once believed love was enough. That woman no longer existed. The next morning, he received a voice message from Linda. Her voice was cold, businesslike. "Richard, I'm not trying to hurt you, okay? I just need space to breathe. You'll be fine. You're strong." He listened to it 6 times, searching for remorse, for softness. There was none, just the echo of convenience. Anita came by later that day with jollof rice and a flask of hot tea. She said nothing about the eviction. She just sat with him in silence. That, in that moment, was all he needed, not answers, just someone who didn't treat him like a broken file to be discarded. Linda's online presence skyrocketed in the following weeks. With Toby by her side, who introduced himself as a multi-branding entrepreneur, she transformed into a version of herself that no one from her past recognized. "A queen is nothing without her throne," she captioned one photo, dressed in silk beside a luxury car that didn't belong to her. Her followers celebrated her glow-up, calling her an inspiration. But what they didn't know was that the glow was funded by quick loans, credit schemes, and a desperate desire to bury her past, starting with Richard. She went on a podcast, calling herself a survivor of toxic poverty, and when asked about her ex-husband, she laughed and said, "Some men are good, just in the wrong financial bracket." The crowd cheered. For Linda, the applause replaced the love she once had. In her mind, she wasn't cruel. She was evolving. Meanwhile, Richard adjusted to life on the floor of Anita's one-room flat. She offered him the bed, but he refused. "I'm fine here," he said. At night, she'd find him staring at the ceiling, whispering to God, "Did I love too much? Or did I just love the wrong person?" His phone rarely rang. The only messages were from his students, asking when lessons would resume. The man who once led a family now had no address, no spouse, and no voice. And yet, he didn't curse Linda. He didn't post cryptic messages or beg for sympathy. He just endured, quietly. Even when Pamela posted a video mocking broke teachers who think love is enough, Richard just watched it and sighed. His heartbreak wasn't loud, it was dignified. And dignity, in a world obsessed with noise, often looked like weakness. The only person who truly saw him was Anita. She brought him books, made him tea, and refused to let his pain define him. One night, Richard broke down. "Why wasn't I enough?" he asked. Anita touched his hand and whispered, "You were more than enough." She just didn't know what enough meant. That night, something shifted. Not in their relationship, but in Richard's soul. He began to reread his old investment documents. A startup he had once invested in, long forgotten, had just gone public. Anita helped him make calls, revive his portfolio, and by the next week, Richard's name was quietly added to a list of shareholders that made headlines in the financial world. But no one knew. Not Linda. Not Pamela. Not the world that mocked him. His comeback wouldn't be loud. It would be wholly poetic and precise. Toby's charm was like perfume, strong at first, then irritating once it lingered. He convinced Linda that their union would be powerful if marketed properly. "Let's do something no one has done, a conjoined wedding brand. We'll call it Royal Rebirth," he said. Linda was thrilled. She imagined cameras, celebrities, hashtags. Toby drew up a proposal, not for love, but for leverage. Behind the scenes, he forged Linda's signature on business loans and used her image to secure deals. But Linda didn't care. All she saw was glitter. When Anita tried to speak with her during a chance encounter at a boutique, Linda scoffed. "Look at you, still wearing slippers. I don't take advice from women who settle for crumbs. You're too basic to understand rich love." Anita blinked. "I understand sacrifice," she said quietly. "That's more than love. That's foundation." Linda laughed and walked away. Pamela continued to hype her sister up, not out of love, but out of envy disguised as encouragement. "You're doing well," she'd say. "Don't let poor people pull you back." But she secretly hated the attention Linda was getting. She would borrow Linda's clothes, fake her own online life, and speak behind her back. "Let's see how long this one lasts," she once texted a friend. But Linda was too far gone to notice. She was preparing for her rebranding wedding with a man she barely knew, financed by wealth she didn't understand, while discarding the man who once gave her everything. In one interview, she called Toby her destiny partner. Richard saw the clip in silence. He smiled faintly, not out of pain, but out of pity. He had finally accepted it. The woman he loved no longer existed. As the wedding planning intensified, so did the lies. Linda's friends knew Toby was cheating. Some had seen him at clubs with other women, but no one warned her. They didn't care. They just wanted to wear aso-ebi and trend online. Anita, who now worked as a communications advisor, was approached by a client who turned out to be one of Toby's victims. "He's a fraud," the woman said. "He scams rich women and vanishes." Anita's heart dropped. She didn't want to hurt Richard again. But this time, she knew silence would only deepen the wound. She called him. "She's in danger," she said. Richard was quiet for a long time. Then he replied, "Let her learn. Some betrayals only make sense when you walk barefoot through the fire." Anita understood. This wasn't about revenge. It was about fate, and fate was about to show Linda the price of pride. Anita's apartment was small, but it felt like a sanctuary. Richard no longer woke up to Linda's cold silence, or Pamela's insults disguised as advice. Instead, he woke to the smell of freshly boiled water and the quiet rustling of pages. Anita reading a devotional beside him on the mat. The two never crossed boundaries. Anita respected his space, and Richard respected the healing they were both trying to grasp. But behind Anita's calm presence, she was watching something bloom inside him, a flicker of life that had almost been extinguished. Richard was changing. Slowly, he began journaling again, pulling out old folders filled with business notes and investment documents he once believed were dead ends. And then came the shock. A company he had invested in years ago, Maple Tech, had just secured a major federal contract. Overnight, their stock exploded. Richard was one of the early investors. His portfolio, once ignored, was now worth tens of millions. He didn't jump. He didn't scream. He simply sat down and wept. Not for joy, but for all the days he begged life to notice him while it passed him by. Anita held him as the tears fell. "God doesn't forget faithful people," she whispered. The next day, Richard hired a financial advisor, a lawyer, and opened a new account. He bought a modest two-bedroom home on the outskirts of town under a different name. He didn't want headlines. He didn't want revenge. He just wanted peace. He set up a trust fund in his late father's name and quietly began sponsoring indigent students, students like Pamela once was, but who wouldn't grow up mocking the hands that fed them. He returned to teaching part-time at a local school, not for money, but because it gave him purpose. His wealth wasn't loud. It didn't scream. It whispered, moved, and rebuilt with grace. While Richard worked in silence, Anita became more than just a friend. She became his balance. She didn't ask for anything, never hinted at romance, never reminded him of Linda. But Richard saw her. He saw the way she believed in him when even he had stopped. One evening over dinner he told her, "You are the kind of woman men overlook because you don't shout your worth, but you're priceless." Anita smiled, her eyes moist. "And you're the kind of man women don't realize is gold until they've thrown you in the gutter." They didn't need to define their bond. What they shared couldn't be described, it could only be felt. And while the world still saw Richard as that poor teacher Linda left, he was now a silent billionaire, walking through the shadows, unseen, unbothered, and unbeholden to anyone who once mocked him. When Maple Tech made the headlines, the world gasped. The federal government had awarded them a multi-year contract, and the company's CEO publicly thanked the early investors who believed in them. One name appeared briefly on the shareholder list, Richard O. Adebayo. But no one connected the dots. He wasn't flamboyant, didn't throw parties, and didn't flaunt luxury cars. He lived modestly, drove a clean Camry, and still wore plain shirts to the store. Even his new home looked ordinary on the outside. Only his accountant and Anita knew just how wealthy he had become. Linda, oblivious to it all, continued her glamorous parade with Toby. She didn't know that the man she discarded now sat in meetings with senators and owned equity in 3 growing startups. Richard didn't care about fame. He only cared about peace, and protecting the dignity he almost lost trying to prove his worth to someone who never saw it. Richard's new mission became one of quiet purpose. He formed the Al-Yarimi Foundation, named after his late mother, and began assisting widows and struggling teachers. His inbox was filled with letters, some from women whose husbands abandoned them, others from men who felt useless in their homes. He read every letter, cried over some, and funded many. He told his legal team, "I want to be what I never had, someone who reminds the forgotten that they matter." His story was still unknown to the public, and he liked it that way. He didn't want Linda to know, not yet. Let her have her fantasy. Let her continue posing with rented cars, while mocking a man who now owned half the companies that sponsored her influencer events. Karma, after all, didn't need speed. It needed precision. But even in his new life, Richard never let bitterness take root. When Anita asked if he'd ever confront Linda, he simply said, "No. She'll find me when her applause dies down. The silence will lead her back. Not to me, but to the truth." And he was right. The world was beginning to whisper. Toby, her new man, was being investigated for fraud. Some vendors from their wedding complained about bounce checks. A luxury bag Linda had posted was exposed as fake by a popular blogger. But she kept pretending, kept smiling, kept posting. Because pride doesn't unravel instantly. It unravels in slow, quiet, humiliating pieces. Meanwhile, Richard sat across town, drinking tea with Anita, filling scholarship forms, and watching the sunset. For the first time in years, he felt whole. Not because he had money, but because he had let go of her, of the pain, of needing to be seen by someone who was blind all along. Linda's wedding to Toby was the grandest event in her social circle. It trended online for a week. The venue was dripping in gold accents, imported roses, and LED screens that played their pre-wedding video. A dramatic montage of luxury, kisses, and promises. Linda walked in wearing a glittering gown that cost nearly 3 million naira, escorted by Pamela, who smiled for the cameras like it was her own wedding. Guests cheered, influencers posted, and Linda bathed in the admiration she believed she finally deserved. From trenches to treasure, she whispered under her breath, smiling at the sea of clapping hands. But what no one knew was that Toby had funded none of it. Most of the bills were settled using Linda's money, processed through fake vendor accounts Toby had created under new names. She thought she was marrying a boss. In reality, she had married a fraud in an expensive suit. Days after the wedding, vendors began to call. Checks bounced. Receipts didn't match. Some discovered they'd been paid in fake foreign bills. When Linda questioned Toby, he deflected. "It's a minor issue, baby. I have people fixing it." But his phone was always on silent. His emails were locked. Pamela noticed and whispered to Linda, "You sure about this guy?" But it was too late. Linda couldn't admit her dream wedding was a nightmare. So she posted more. More smiles. More designer clothes. More fake captions. "Married to my destiny partner," she wrote, while her bank account slowly bled into Toby's offshore shell company. Her friends noticed the tension, but didn't care. They had worn the Aso-ebi, trended online, and left. No one stays for the aftermath of a wedding built on illusion. As Linda tried to contain the chaos, she saw something that made her freeze. A billboard on a major highway. The Richard Foundation, built by pain, powered by peace. The image of Richard in a tailored navy blue suit beside Anita, holding a plaque for community service, burned into her eyes. Her breath caught. The man she had thrown out in torn slippers now looked like royalty. She zoomed in on Anita's hand on his shoulder. Her pulse raced. The comments on the post beneath it were glowing. "This man is a blessing. His story inspired me. We need more Richards in this world." Linda's lips trembled. Her makeup smudged. The weight of regret began to settle, not in her chest, but in her spine. She couldn't stand straight. Her back bent under the realization. She didn't just leave him, she abandoned her miracle. It started with a missing N200,000. Linda had wired the money to a vendor recommended by Toby for a boutique she wanted to start. Days later, the vendor disappeared. Then came the discovery that Toby had used her signature to secure a car loan. She confronted him late at night, trembling as she threw receipts at his feet. "What is this? Why is money missing? Who is Mrs. L. Toby on these forms?" He didn't flinch. He simply sipped his drink and smiled. "You're my wife. What's mine is yours, and what's yours, well, you won't miss it." That was the night it all crumbled. His charm, his sweet voice, the perfect wedding. It all shattered like a broken mirror. Linda realized then that she hadn't married a man. She had married a leech with expensive perfume and a borrowed Rolex. But the most brutal blow came the next morning when she saw messages between Toby and her makeup artist, flirty texts, private photos, and even receipts of hotels booked during their wedding week. The betrayal sent her reeling. She called Pamela, but her number was switched off. She stormed into her apartment only to discover it was empty. Pamela had packed out without warning, taking a few of Linda's expensive shoes with her. Linda collapsed on the floor of her living room, gasping through sobs. The walls echoed with silence. No one came. No one called. Her followers still liked her posts, but there was no one to cry to. No Richard to hold her hand and say, "We'll figure it out." She reached for her bank app. It showed a balance of N11,520. Panic clawed at her throat. She frantically began dialing numbers, trying to recover money from vendors, from friends, from anyone. But her number had already been blocked by many. She had gone from a trending bride to a financial embarrassment within weeks. Pride didn't just come before a fall. In Linda's case, it came before total ruin. And when she tried reporting Toby, the police laughed. Madam, your husband? You both did a joint wedding. Everything was in your name. You have no case. He had legally wiped her out. Every transaction bore her name. The boutique? Gone. The apartment? In rent default. The luxury car she had posted? Repossessed. Her fake world crumbled until only her real reflection remained. A broke woman with designer bags she could no longer afford to fill. The woman who once said, "Love without money is bondage," was now in a real prison, emotional, financial, and mental. For the first time, Linda thought of Richard, not out of love, but out of need. The man she discarded like a threadbare rag was now the only person who had never taken from her, only given. She opened her phone to search his name, and what she saw next stole the breath from her chest. The day Linda was thrown out of her apartment, it wasn't with the drama she had once used to chase Richard. There were no loud threats or security guards. Just a cold letter from the landlord's office, and a junior staff escorting her out with pity in his eyes. Madam, you're owing 4 months. Please, just drop the keys. She stood there, holding 2 suitcases and a pile of branded nylon bags, filled with clothes that couldn't pay rent. As she stood on the roadside, people passed by, some looking twice. Wasn't that the woman from Instagram? The one who said God did it? She avoided eye contact, pulled down her cap, and dragged her bags to a friend's house. But even the friend, after a week of sleeping on the couch and eating noodles, asked her politely to leave. Babe, you know I love you, but things are tight. I need space too. She tried reaching Pamela again, still no response. The one sister she thought would always stand by her had ghosted her completely. She didn't know Pamela had long moved on, living with a new boyfriend and spreading rumors that Linda messed everything up with her big mouth. Her social circle had vanished. All the women who posted "Congrats, sis" on her wedding photos now ignored her texts. Her inbox was full of read receipts, read, ignored, and discarded. She had become what she once mocked, a wandering, broke woman with no roof over her head and no one to turn to. Every day, she wore one of her glamorous wedding gowns as a jacket, trying to preserve dignity in the face of rot. One evening, she walked past a billboard and saw it again, Richard and Anita, smiling, surrounded by school children. The Richard Foundation, built by pain, powered by peace. Her knees buckled. She stumbled into a nearby bench and buried her face in her palms. The tears didn't fall, they exploded. Not just from her eyes, but from her soul. She saw it now, all of it. How she had mocked the only man who ever loved her, laughed at his poverty, posted lies about their breakup, and handed her future to a con artist. And now he was everything she dreamed of, only without her. Worse, Anita, the very friend she mocked as basic, was now standing beside the throne Linda thought she deserved. Her breath shook as the shame strangled her. She remembered her own words. Poor men will do everything to show love except money. And now, the only man who had ever truly loved her had more money than her new dreams could ever imagine. And she? She had no home, no husband, no sister, and no one to blame except herself. Linda wandered through the streets, numb and directionless, like a woman floating inside her own regret. She found a small salon tucked beside a grocery store and begged the owner to let her help wash hair in exchange for food. The owner, recognizing her from social media, hesitated, not out of awe, but confusion. You? Are you not the wedding lady? Linda nodded, barely able to speak. She was given a broom, a seat at the back, and a plate of rice. There was no paycheck, no respect, but there was survival. She lived in the back room, beside empty shampoo cartons. At night, she stared at the ceiling and whispered Richard's name. Not because she wanted him back, but because she couldn't believe what she had thrown away. Every day, she passed his billboard on her way to the market. And every day, her chest burned with shame. One morning, a group of students passed by laughing. They were holding flyers from a scholarship program hosted by the Richard Foundation. I heard he used to be broke, one girl said. Now he's richer than the governor. They all cheered. One of them held up a photo. Linda froze. It was Richard, in a black suit, beside Anita, presenting a check to a university. Her hands trembled. She remembered that suit. She once helped him buy it on discount, back when they were scraping. And now, the same man who begged her to stay had become the man the world celebrated. Her mouth went dry. She wanted to scream. She wanted to weep. But all she could do was walk, slowly, like a ghost, to the billboard again. She touched it gently, as if the image would speak back. But it didn't. It just stared back at her, complete without her. Later that day, Anita and Richard passed by in a black SUV. They didn't see her, but she saw them. Anita's head was on his shoulder. He laughed, a deep, unbothered laugh. Linda ducked behind a kiosk and watched as they drove away. That laugh haunted her all night. She had once told him, no woman wants to be laughing in poverty. But now, she was crying in shame, while the man she left was laughing in peace. And suddenly, she understood the cruel irony of life. She didn't just lose a man. She lost herself the day she stopped seeing his worth. Her pride had purchased her downfall, and no amount of trending hashtags could undo the price. She leaned against the billboard one last time and whispered, "I'm sorry." But it was too late. The world had moved on, and so had Richard. The event was meant to be a quiet charity fundraiser, a gathering of donors, journalists, and volunteers to honor the Richard Foundation's 5th School Building Initiative. Richard stood tall behind the podium in a black agbada, his voice steady as he spoke of the power of resilience. Anita stood beside him, elegantly dressed in a modest gown, holding a small boy who had just received a scholarship. The crowd clapped with admiration. Cameras flashed. Then, from the back of the hall, came a screech. "You!" All heads turned as Linda, unkempt, her wig slightly off-center, stormed into the venue. Her eyes were red, her voice shaky but loud. "That's my husband. That's my man. You think you can just replace me like I never existed?" Gasps filled the room. Security stepped forward, but Richard raised a hand. The silence that followed was heavier than any speech he had given that evening. Linda stood before the crowd, trembling with a cocktail of regret and desperation. "She took him from me," she shouted, pointing at Anita. "She stole my marriage, my life." Anita didn't flinch. She looked at Richard, who stepped forward slowly. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He simply looked at Linda with tired eyes and said, "You lost me long before she found me." The words hung in the air like thunder. "You left when I needed a partner. You mocked me when I gave you my last. You betrayed the love that built you. Don't rewrite the story now, because it hurts." Linda's legs buckled. "I was confused. I was under pressure." Richard raised a hand again. "No. You were greedy. You wanted glitter, not gold. And now the dust has cleared." Journalists captured every moment. The tears, the silence, the brutal truth. But no one applauded. They watched as Linda slowly sank to the floor. Security gently escorted her outside, not with force, but pity. She collapsed near the parking lot, sobbing into her hands. Outside the gate, children selling snacks whispered among themselves. "Isn't that the lady who left that man?" one said. "Chai. She's not fine again, oh." Linda heard every word. She curled up beside the pavement, her designer shoes soaked in the evening rain. Inside the hall, Richard resumed his speech. He didn't mention Linda again. He simply said, "Pain refines us. But if we run from it, we lose the chance to grow." The hall erupted with applause. And as he and Anita held hands and walked off the stage, Linda stared at them through the iron bars of the gate, realizing she hadn't just lost a man. She had lost her seat at a table she once set fire to, and now she wasn't even invited back to sweep the ashes. 3 days after the fundraiser, Linda sat alone at a rundown salon, sweeping hair to earn her next meal. Her phone buzzed for the first time in days. It was Pamela. The name made her stomach churn. "We need to talk," the message read. At first, Linda ignored it, but curiosity clawed at her until she agreed. They met at a cheap bar in Surulere, the same place Richard once took them both to celebrate Pamela's graduation. But this time, there was no joy. Pamela walked in wearing sunglasses and sat across from her with a smirk. "You finally broke," she said. It's funny. I thought it would take longer. Linda frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Pamela leaned forward. You were never supposed to be happy. I made sure of that. Silence. Linda blinked. What? Pamela pulled off her glasses and said, You want to know the truth? I was always jealous. I wanted Richard. But you had him. Linda's head spun. Pamela continued without remorse. Remember when I told you he wasn't man enough for you? That he was dragging you down? That no fine woman should be with a teacher? Linda nodded slowly. Pamela leaned closer. That was me poisoning your mind. Because I knew if you left him, I'd have a chance. But guess what? He never even looked at me. Not once. Linda's lips parted, but no words came. Pamela smirked. You were stupid. You let your biggest blessing go, because I whispered poison into your ears. Linda's hands trembled. You destroyed my marriage, she shouted, standing to her feet. Pamela shrugged. No, sis. You did that. I just gave you the tools. You chose to use them. The waiter stared awkwardly. Linda collapsed back into her seat, gasping. All those years of advice, all those insults Pamela directed at Richard, all those moments she encouraged Linda to level up, they weren't for Linda's good. They were sabotage. Pamela stood to leave. I came to tell you because, well, I've moved on. And you deserve to know who really ruined your life. She dropped a receipt on the table. Good luck sweeping salons. Maybe next time you'll learn to see through envy disguised as love. She walked out, her heels clicking like a drumbeat of finality. Linda sat frozen, heartbroken all over again, not just by betrayal, but by her own blindness. She thought she'd been surrounded by love, by loyalty. But even her own blood had been rooting for her downfall. And the worst part? She had pushed away the only person who was never pretending. Richard hadn't just been her husband. He had been her protector, her compass, her home. And now that home had been given to someone who never asked for it, because she, in her pride, burned it down brick by brick. Back at the salon, Linda moved like a shadow. She no longer tried to explain her past. Everyone knew. Her face was no longer adorned with glam or filters. It was raw, exposed, lined with regret. Her clients gossiped when she turned around. One of them once said, I used to envy her wedding. Now look at her. But Linda no longer flinched. She had become numb to shame, not because she accepted her new life, but because she was finally facing her reflection, without filters. Every morning, she looked in the mirror and whispered the same question. What did I do? And every day, the mirror replied with silence, because some mistakes are too loud for answers. Her life, once curated and applauded, was now hidden in corners and back rooms. The woman who once screamed for space had now been given so much of it, she was drowning in it. Anita's face was everywhere. Billboards, flyers, television ads for upcoming charity galas. Linda saw her smiling beside Richard, holding hands with children, shaking hands with dignitaries. It wasn't the photos that stung. It was the warmth in Richard's eyes, the kind of warmth Linda used to see directed at her. And now it belonged to someone else. Someone who never tried to compete, who never mocked his dreams, who never asked him to be someone he wasn't. And then came the final sting. Anita was invited to speak at a conference on loyalty and leadership. Linda watched the live stream from a phone at the salon. She expected to hear bitterness. Instead, Anita spoke gently. Sometimes, life takes everything from you, not to break you, but to introduce you to what you deserve. I didn't steal anyone. I just stood beside what others threw away. Linda dropped the phone, her eyes flooded. That night, she walked past a supermarket and saw Richard and Anita inside, picking snacks with a group of orphans. They looked happy. Not fake happy, not Instagram happy, genuinely happy. A small girl tugged at Richard's arm and said, Daddy, can I have two? Richard laughed. Take three. Linda stood behind a glass window, her heart breaking piece by piece. She whispered, that could have been me. But it wasn't, because she had made a choice, and now she was living inside the echo of it. Her pride had cost her a future. Her silence had fed her betrayal. Her sister had pushed her off a cliff, but it was Linda who jumped. And the fall had no end in sight. The salon was unusually quiet that morning. Linda sat in the back, threading a client's hair in silence, her fingers numb with routine. A little girl, no older than 7, came in with her mother for a simple braid. The child was bubbly, full of life, and smiled at everyone. "Auntie, do you know Mr. Richard?" she asked mid-conversation. Linda froze. She didn't look up. "Which Richard?" she whispered. The girl beamed. "Mr. Richard, that gave my mummy a job. He's so kind. He paid my school fees, even though we are not rich. My mummy says he's an angel." Linda's hand trembled. The braid slipped. The mother, sitting beside her, added softly, "He changed our lives. His foundation doesn't just give, they care. I wish every rich man was like him. And that woman beside him? She's so kind too. I think they're married now. God bless them." The words punched Linda in the chest like iron fists. She smiled faintly, nodded, and excused herself to the back room. Alone, she leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. Not because the truth was new, but because hearing it from a child made it real. Richard had not just moved on. He had become a blessing to others, the kind of man she used to mock for being too soft. He was no longer the teacher scraping coins to buy her sanitary pads. He was a father figure, a community leader, a voice for the voiceless. And Anita, the woman she had laughed at for having no ambition, now walked beside a man she had respected in his worst and now honored in his best. Linda collapsed to the floor, tears falling silently, burning her cheeks like acid. Her pride had robbed not only her, but generations she could have touched through Richard's kindness. She cried until her eyes swelled shut, not from envy, but from a kind of grief that no words could ever fully capture, the grief of a woman who killed her own future with her own hands. When she returned to the front desk, the child smiled and hugged her. "God will bless you too, Auntie." Linda knelt down, looked into the girl's eyes and whispered, "I hope he still can." That night, she walked the streets slowly, her soul heavier than the bag on her shoulder. At a junction, she passed a newspaper stand. The headline read, "From Humble Teacher to Silent Billionaire, the Richard Adebayo Story." Linda didn't buy it. She didn't need to. She had lived it from the front row, before walking away. And now, all she could do was watch the credits roll on a story she could have co-written, but chose instead to delete herself from. It was a Sunday afternoon. Richard and Anita had just finished a visit to a nearby orphanage, arms filled with donated books and boxes of food. They stepped out of the supermarket, laughing softly, walking toward their car. A little boy ran ahead to open the trunk. "Daddy, look what I found," he shouted. Richard lifted him, kissed his forehead, and said, "You're my treasure." Anita smiled and linked arms with him. From across the road, Linda stood in silence, hidden beneath the shade of a mango tree, dressed in a faded blouse and slippers worn thin. She clutched a polythene bag with bread and paracetamol, all she could afford. Her eyes locked on them, and for a moment time froze. Her body ached, not from hunger, but from the weight of what-ifs. She saw the joy on Richard's face, the peace that money never gave her, the peace she once had in his arms and rejected. She didn't cry this time. There were no tears left, just silence, just shame. She turned to walk away, but her eyes wouldn't let go. She had imagined this moment for so long, where she would apologize, fall to her knees, beg for a second chance. But now she knew. That door had closed the day she laughed at his broken shoes and called his love burdensome. That door had locked the moment she let Pamela poison her heart. She stood quietly as they drove away. Richard never saw her. Or maybe he did, and chose not to look. Either way, it didn't matter. Because she had finally accepted it. Some losses are self-inflicted, and not all wounds deserve healing. As she reached the junction near her street, a beggar reached out his hand. Linda paused, opened her nylon bag, and gave him the bread. The man smiled. "God bless you." She nodded and kept walking, head down, step slow. She no longer wished to be seen. Not by the world. Not by Richard. Not even by herself. Behind her, the billboard glowed again. Built by pain. powered by peace. And in that moment, Linda realized something no motivational quote had ever taught her. Money doesn't break people. Pride does. Betrayal does. And when love is discarded like trash, the only thing left to hold is regret. The road was long, and for the first time in her life, Linda didn't want to arrive anywhere. She just wanted to walk, and keep walking, until the woman she used to be was too far behind to follow her anymore. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.